All right, thank you very much. Jeffrey, thank you. Thanks for the shout out to my wife as well. I'm sorry she couldn't be here. Okay, we're now going to hear from Indra Nooyi. Indra Nooyi is a great leader who leads one of the most visible companies in the world. She's very well known. She is, for those of you who look at the world's most powerful lists and so on, she is on a lot of them. I've had a chance to interact with this woman behind the scenes of those lists, and I've come to know someone who has a very fierce intellect, of course, very strong determination. You can't lead a company like PepsiCo without that, and also just someone who's very, very insightful in terms of how she interacts with people and how she leads. I've seen her debate water issues with people who work on water every single day, and I think she knows as much as they do about that. I mentioned last night that Indra spoke at one point that characteristics of leaders today in our interconnected and global world have to lead not only intellectually, but also with their head, their hearts, and their hands. And I really love that quote and that combination. And I think it speaks to the range of things and the interconnectedness that we all have to understand and we all have to be able to shape. That's how the world works today. It's not optional. And in fact, that is actually how we try to work at BSR, combining both vision and practicality. And so as I welcome Indra Nooyi to the stage, I want to say, Indra, welcome, and given the way you think about the world, if you ever get bored doing what you're doing at PepsiCo, you have a job waiting for you at BSR.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, for that kind introduction, and thank you to BSR for welcoming here today. I know that over the years, the BSR conference has become not just one of the premier business sustainability events, but one of the most premier business conferences, period. So it's an honor to be here today and to speak to all of you. We're here, of course, to talk about some very important and frankly heavy topics: sustainability, transformation, transparency, the future of business, the nature of capitalism. So I thought I'd start my remarks this way in the most solemn and appropriate way possible with a cartoon. And if you look at this cartoon, this is one that appeared in the issue of The New Yorker a couple of years ago, and it sums up the view that many people hold about capitalism. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Tattered suit, post-apocalyptic city. As you can see, not so great. And for those of us who work in business, who in fact work to improve business, it's troubling. Because while this view may reflect the consequences of how some people behave in the capitalist system, it does not illustrate what capitalism stands for and the good that capitalism has the potential to create. Historically, capitalism and free markets have been the undisputed engine of global progress. And just for a moment, sit back and consider the tremendous value that capitalism has created for the world at large. Free markets have spurred technological progress, from the way we travel, to the way we communicate, to the way we heal. Capitalism has multiplied the opportunities for people not just to work, but to thrive. And thanks to new products, new services, and new ideas, the quality of life, even the duration of life, has dramatically improved for billions of people. It's clear that capitalism works, and yet that cartoon in The New Yorker still resonates. Which brings me to the question: if capitalism is responsible for so much good, why is it taking on so much heat? And I think the answer is that capitalism today is facing a crisis. The system is not creating enough value, and the path that we're on is simply not sustainable. We see it all around us. The evidence is all there. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening, with the World Bank projecting recently that 1 billion people will live in extreme poverty next year. You know, what was ironic, just this week I received in the mail 3 different publications from 3 very reputable think tanks. And the cover story on all 3 was about inequality. Inequality in the world, inequality in the United States, and what we're going to do about it. Food supplies are failing to meet global demand, leaving over 800 million people around the world undernourished. Unsustainable water use is depleting water tables and is contributing to water stress for 2/3 of the world's population. And excessive greenhouse gas emissions are accelerating climate change, with glaciers melting at such a rate that scientists are now saying that we've passed the point of no return. And beyond the inherent need to solve these problems for their own sake, the reality is that if we don't address these now, business will not be able to succeed in the future. Capitalism just cannot function to its fullest potential when such a large number of people are unable to contribute to the system, and the resources on which the system depends are being depleted at such a rapid rate. And that's the crisis we face, and I believe the reason we are facing this crisis is that capitalism just may have been hijacked by short-term thinking. The drive to increase profits now at all costs, without considering the long-term impact, has resulted in decision-making that's damaging for business, for society, and for the planet. And the UN Global Compact recently found that companies that focus only on the short term fail to devote adequate resources to R&D, they don't develop new markets, they don't expand their customer base, they don't find efficiencies, they don't grow human capital, they don't manage risk adequately. All of which, I'm sure all of us would agree, are critical facets to running a successful business. And we saw this destructive mindset on display during the terrible financial crisis that we all went through just a few years ago. But sadly, I don't believe too much has changed. In fact, I'd argue that short-termism is more in vogue now than ever. In 2013, a McKinsey survey said that 63%, almost 2/3 of senior executives and board members surveyed said that the pressure to generate short-term results has increased over the past 5 years. And keep in mind, this is exactly the same time frame that the financial crisis hit all of us. Meanwhile, this is a statistic that's terribly bothersome. Here in the United States, the average holding period for stocks has steadily declined from 7 years in the middle of the 20th century to less than 3 months today. Less than 3 months today. Across every sector, at every level of government, and even across the NGOs, there is a tendency towards instant short-term gratification. Simply put, I would observe that short-termism is the biggest barrier to sustainability and inequality that we face today. So let's step back and look at the big picture. There was a first chapter of capitalism, and that succeeded in creating unprecedented value for humanity. But I think the time has come now to write the second chapter of capitalism, a new chapter in which we achieve a proper balance between short-term profitability and long-term sustainability. And the first changes have to be made within businesses. You know, it's no easy mission for a company to balance the level of profitability and the duration of profitability, but it can be done. And let me reflect back on my own personal experience. I joined the senior leadership of PepsiCo 20 years ago. And at that time, we were predominantly a snack food and a soda company, plain and simple. But we noticed then that consumer demand was shifting. So back in 1998, as a team, we went out and bought Tropicana, we bought Quaker Oats. We bought those properties just to evolve our business model for a changing society. But we knew also that we had to do a lot more in order to become a truly sustainable business. So in 2006, when I became CEO, we instituted a direction for the company which we call Performance with Purpose. And at the time, you know, many companies focused on programs that donated money to charitable causes and gave back to society through volunteerism, all good things. But I had a slightly different intention. I wanted to change how PepsiCo made money, not what we did with the money we earned. Because at that time, when people talked about giving back and corporate social responsibility, it was all about what do you do with the money you earned. I thought PepsiCo ought to set the model for how we made the money. So we took a close look at our operations and saw 3 areas where we could do just that. First, our product portfolio. Focus on human sustainability. We saw an opportunity to reduce sodium, saturated fat levels, added sugar levels across the portfolio. And we also worked across the portfolio to include more nutritious products, more whole grains, more fruit and vegetable, more protein. And in 2013, more than 20% of our net revenue now comes from what we call nutrition or good for you businesses. So that was the first plank of performance with purpose. Yes, performance is very important, but this is the first part of our purpose, human sustainability. Transform our portfolio of products so that our company can keep performing well into the future. The second plank of performance with purpose was environmental sustainability. You know, we're a large company and a major manufacturer worldwide. We're also one of the world's largest agricultural buyers. The majority of what we buy, whether it's potatoes, oats, corn, oranges, they're all based on agriculture. Therefore, we have a tremendous stake in environmental sustainability. We also use a lot of water because we make beverages which are predominantly water. So let me give you an example of things we did. Let me take India. I grew up in India. Very, very water stressed as a country. We realized we had to do something in the country to really improve the water balance of our plants and the communities in which we operate. So we collaborated with communities and agricultural organizations to build recharge ponds and check dams so that the communities in which we operate actually could do better rainwater harvesting and get more access to water. And we did this not just within our supply chain, we also did this in communities outside of our supply chain. And the result of all of this is that since 2009, PepsiCo in India is water positive, meaning that we conserve more water than we use in our plants. Our suppliers in India have become more profitable. PepsiCo in India has become more profitable and efficient. And communities have improved access to water. And as a result, here's the good news. We have a license to operate in India, and we've maintained it. Our plants have not been shut down. We have a license to operate. So that's number 2, environmental sustainability, reducing our environmental impact, and we're working very hard at it. The third aspect of performance with purpose is to invest in our most important asset, our people, what we call talent sustainability. We want our employees to bring their whole selves to work, their values, their experiences, their perspectives, because we believe if they brought their whole selves to work, it makes the company stronger. I can give you a lot of examples of what we've done for employees, but I've just picked one because this is something I think is unusual and you might enjoy hearing about it. It's called the PepsiCo program. PepsiCo members use their business skills and technical expertise to improve underserved communities around the world. And then they bring back the skills they've developed to improve PepsiCo. And believe me, this program was not conceived by senior managers or a CEO, but 8 junior employees who wanted to change the company and make a difference in the world at the same time proposed this idea. So every year we pick 3 or 4 projects and we give people adequate time, and they remain on our payroll. They go and do this project in many, many needy communities around the world. They learn how to work with multiple stakeholders and solve difficult problems, and they bring the experience back to PepsiCo. It's been a huge win for us. We are training our associates to think adaptively. We're giving them exposure to global cultures, and we're teaching them how to work with multiple stakeholders. What's even more amazing is it's been a great tool to attract young talent who want to be challenged and they want to make an impact in the companies in which they join. Now, you heard me talk about the 3 planks of purpose. Don't mistake one thing. We are focused on performance. We are focused on delivering short-term, top-tier financial returns. But what we do judiciously is balance the level of performance we deliver in the short term so we can keep it going for a long time. That's really what we're focused on. And I share with you these stories about performance with purpose, not to tell you that our transformation is complete, far from it. The only reason I talk to you about performance with purpose is because I really think a lot can be done to change the way business operates from the inside, despite the short-term pressures that exist on the outside. But make no mistake, we cannot write the second chapter of capitalism until those external pressures subside. The seeds of sustainable business cannot take root until the soil of society has been tilled to embrace a long-term perspective. And this, I believe, is the greatest challenge of our time. And to meet this challenge, I want to talk about 3 questions we should really consider. And I hope this conference considers it over the next day or so. The first question, how does the marketplace evaluate the performance of businesses? How does the marketplace, defined as investors, evaluate the performance of businesses? Today, I think largely businesses are evaluated on short-term performance, whether from quarter to quarter or year over year. What's missing, I believe, is a trusted, standardized scorecard to help evaluate whether a company is investing in its longevity, whether it's managing its risk properly, and how well the company's business strategy aligns with society's needs. There are some organizations like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and the Global Reporting Initiative that are working to change this. They are developing new ways to help us better understand a company's contributions to society, a company's environmental record, its resource usage, and strength of human capital. Other things like governance, risk management, investment in R&D. There are people working on it. But we have to accelerate how we implement the scorecard and what pace we do it. Perhaps we need a scorecard at the national level too. You know, most of you must have read the recent Harvard Business Review where Eric Beinhocker and Nick Hanauer made the argument that GDP and growth don't accurately measure the value that business creates for society. Instead, they propose a new measure that takes into account both traditional prosperity and changes in the quality of life. Now, I'm not asking us to throw GDP out, but how do we balance this with a richer set of metrics? In countries like China, government statisticians recently announced that they were going to emphasize GDP and growth rate while focusing on factors that cover stability, innovation, environmental sustainability, and societal well-being. Now, we have to make sure that any scorecards that we develop, we don't create so many reporting requirements that we create an onerous situation for companies. That's not what I'm suggesting. We have to develop a simple, honest, balanced, integrated, and ubiquitous scorecard, one that gives investors the tools they need to see the whole picture and assess the true value of the company. Scorecard is one point, but that alone is not sufficient, which brings me to the second question. How can the business community shift incentives to better create value? Most of you have seen the writings of the Aspen Institute, and they've suggested a revision of the capital gains tax provisions in order to encourage long-term share ownership. I don't know, but would that be enough to encourage investors to reward companies that are making the right strategic decisions to ensure long-term value? But doing that alone is not enough. We have to change the way financial professionals are incentivized. If investment managers are evaluated and rewarded based on annual returns, how can you then set up a scorecard to look at long-term returns for companies? So somehow we have to balance the two. What's more, how can pension funds, the world's largest collective investors, use their size and inherent interest in the long term to encourage the marketplace to focus on sustainable business? And along with that, how can we get media to place more emphasis on covering the long-term strategy and the sustainability of companies as opposed to sensationalizing short-term returns? Now, there are media outlets, many of them covered in this room, who work hard to uncover issues and companies and talk about companies in a comprehensive, nuanced fashion. but I still think the loud voice is given to people who focus on the extreme short term. The people who focus on the long term tend to be the exception and not the rule. And unfortunately, the short-term news cycle just amplifies the short-term voices. So we have to figure out how to change this pattern of coverage, giving more companies who are in the room to take long-term sustainable action. Along with that, how do we rethink executive compensation? So it's a tough topic. I honestly believe that many CEOs that I talk to are not in the job just for the money. Many of us have plenty. I think many of us care deeply for the companies we run, and with that in mind, how do we effectively link compensation to make sure that CEOs are not running the company for the duration of the CEO, but running it really for the duration of the company, which, one is very, very long term, and one is, relatively short term versus the duration of the company. How do we make sure CEOs run companies for the duration of the company, not the duration of the CEO? And finally, how can we ensure that we deliver on the promise of this next chapter of capitalism by training future business leaders? We have to reform MBA education. We have to teach the next generation of executives and CEOs that they have to work with multiple stakeholders. They have to consider business issues in the context of a larger society across multiple disciplines. I always have a tongue-in-cheek comment I make when I'm up at my own business school. I always tell them that in the business schools, we tell them, go make money at all costs. If something goes wrong, hire somebody from your law school. And if something goes wrong with the environment, hire somebody from the environmental school. And if everything goes wrong, get the divinity school to pray for you. That is not how it's supposed to work. That is not how it's supposed to work. Let me tell you another thing, and I watch business school education because I'm intimately involved with the Yale Business School, and I've got families sitting in various other business schools. What is the pressure to rush through case studies, 3, 4, 5 a week? Kids are just skimming through business education as opposed to taking one case for 1 week or 2 weeks, getting all of the constituencies that could impact that business case to really come in and talk about that business case in great detail so that our MBA students understand that life is not about just skipping from case to case and addressing issues superficially, but they have to be understood for their richness, for their complexity, and really delve into the multiple facets that business leaders are presented with on a day-to-day basis. So we have to reform business education in profound ways. I think we're doing our young generation a disservice by not reforming that. The thing is, all of these questions are worthy of consideration, but no one answer will be the silver bullet. That we know. Which brings me to the third and final question that I believe is critical. How do we unleash a new era where competition and collaboration drive value creation? Again, let me zoom out a bit and consider the big picture. In the first chapter of capitalism, we said ruthless competition. That was the essence of business. If companies cooperated, it was strictly for their own self-interest to make more money, which is all okay. But in this new chapter of capitalism, we have to figure out how we can continue to compete but also cooperate. And I'll give you some examples. But the cooperation is more for the sake of society. If you take some of the world's greatest challenges, water scarcity, climate change, inequality, I don't believe any one company acting on its own can solve these issues. And I don't believe companies acting independently can solve these issues. We have to figure out how companies, governments, NGOs all come together, collaborate, and solve these issues. That's the only way we're going to make a collective impact on all of these issues. There was a great book, Coopetition, I don't know if you guys have read it, by Adam Brandenburger and Barry Nailbuff. And they discussed this sort of a balance. How can you really function in a coopetition environment? The computer industry does a lot of coopetition. I think we've got to think much more broadly how all companies, along with NGOs, governments, multilateral organizations can work together to solve these issues. I'll give you an example. If we have an idea for solving water scarcity, we should share it much more widely across companies, countries, so that everybody takes those ideas and does things to improve society. Similarly, sustainable packaging, whether it's in cartons or beverage packaging, we should spread these ideas widely because these things make a difference to society. Now, let me give you a sister issue with this. And this is a plea and a call out to NGOs. The spirit of collaboration should go a little bit further. NGOs should not think that criticism and constantly attacking companies is the only way that you get your own legitimacy. It cannot be that way. You know, sometimes when companies make progress on an issue, collaborate, give the company some credit. Don't keep moving the goalposts so that you can garner attention for yourself. If we can all collaborate and say, look, on this particular issue, company has done a great job. Here's the best in class. Why doesn't everybody else follow? That would be a pretty good outcome. Let's all work together to move forward on these issues so we can actually make a difference to society. So it's a plea to any NGO who might be in this room. I think ruthless collaboration, in addition to ruthless competition, would create a virtuous cycle with significant upside for all of society. So the question is, how can we encourage partnerships around pressing issues? How can we strengthen our international institutions to convene the necessary stakeholders and actually measure progress we're making for society? One thing I know for sure, NGOs, multilateral organizations, governments by themselves are not going to make progress without including business at the table. Business are engines of efficiency. And if we can work in partnership with all of the other constituencies, I honestly believe we can make progress. And the reason I say all this is because as I talk to all my fellow CEOs, I talk to employees, I talk to senior executives around the world, in spite of all of the short-term pressures, most people really want to write this next chapter of capitalism. And it's a chapter in which employees won't leave their values at home every day before they go to work. A chapter in which the performance of the private sector is in harmony with the progress of society. A chapter in which value is created for the benefit of all. Which brings me to this question: who will write this next chapter of capitalism? The truth is, I don't believe there is one author. The next chapter will be written by all of you, the next generation of executives, the next generation of subject matter experts, academics, investors, commentators, regulators, nonprofit leaders. Everybody has to come together to write this next chapter of capitalism. This next chapter will not be written by just one person, one institution, or one sector, because the goal of capitalism is to create value, financial, societal, scientific, or otherwise, for everyone in society. We know that value is there, we just need to turn the page. We have to accept that there's a crisis in capitalism and set off to address it. We need to build a sustainable future. So let me close by asking one final question. What are we waiting for? Let's get back to work because we have an awful lot to do. Thank you very much. Where do you want me to sit? Right.
That's just great. You brought your own water. We brought some of your water too.
I picked it up from the bottom of the podium.
Thank you very much, Indra. A great and clear and compelling vision, very consistent with what we've all been talking about. Let me pick up on the theme of writing this next chapter. I think you spoke about something that everyone in this room is very interested in. How do we measure corporate performance? And in fact, the leaders of two of the institutions you mentioned, plus the head of the International Integrated Reporting Council, all these acronyms, are going to be here later today. So what's the role of a company like PepsiCo working with other businesses, other interested parties, you and your fellow CEOs, to help move this even faster? So if we were to start writing this first chapter, who needs to have the pen and what do we need to say?
I don't know who can be the convening authority, and I really don't know. I think all of us companies, many CEOs are working inside the company. I think somebody, maybe the SEC, maybe some accounting standards board which has a bigger mandate, has to convene a group of people. And we've got to stop having meeting after meeting, organization after organization putting their own scorecards. I mean, it's now reached a ridiculous point where we have to report on so many scorecards, on so many metrics, they've become mechanistic as opposed to something that's truly driving the business forward. I think it's time to zero-base this, clean up all these scorecards, and agree on a integrated scorecard for companies that makes sense to include as part of the financial statements. I wish I had an easy answer, because this is where you realize that CEOs are powerless. We think we're very powerful, but we're quite powerless when it comes to this. But I'm hoping organizations like yours can issue the clarion call and get the right group of people to say, guys, you know what? We're sitting with this gold mine and this wonderful instrument called capitalism. Let's really write the next chapter so that we don't read these articles about inequality or environmental issues and just sit back and do nothing about it.
Well, we are and we will do that, and I think the power of the voice that you have and your peers is very, very important. You alluded to something I actually wanted to ask about. There was a piece in the Guardian newspaper from the UK a couple of weeks ago that took on, quote, the myth of the omnipotent CEO. So you undeniably have a great deal of influence, and yet I'm sure during the day you also think about how pushing the levers of power and influence are a bit complicated, even for someone in your position. What are your reflections on that concept?
I don't even know what the omnipotent CEO is. God, CEOship is a very tough job. And you know, some people think that we make change by sending out a memo or making a speech. Wrong. What CEOs have to do to effect change is just tough work. So there is nothing called an omnipotent CEO. What we do have is a pulpit. We have a platform from which we can talk about issues. We have a company where we can effect change. However hard it is, we can effect change. We can be role models. We can be the company that models that you can actually focus on the short and the long term and come out ahead. That's what we can do. That's what we're trying to do. 3 years ago, I wasn't the most popular for doing those things. Today, I'm very popular for doing those things. So, you know, again, you have to have courage. You've got to power through these issues. That's what we can model. And that's, I think, the limits of a CEO's power.
You know, you make a very important point. There's a little bit of a catch-22 here, because you and others are asking for markets to change, and yet markets very often will punish you if you do raise your voice. How do you navigate that?
I think that if you have a strong board, if your strategy is clear, if you personally as a CEO have courage and clarity of purpose and vision, and you're not tanking financial performance, but you're balancing the short and the long term. Because what we're talking about is, should we drive short-term performance to dizzying levels at the expense of the long term, or do you judiciously balance the short and the long term? So I'm talking about judicious balance. I'm not talking about forgetting short-term performance. I want to be very clear. So if you have a strong board, clear strategy, and if you have the backbone and courage to stick with the long-term strategy, I think it can be done. I mean, I tell you, 3 or 4 years ago, I remember meeting investors and them saying to me, why don't you just go back and focus on soda and chips and you'll do great as a company? I said, yeah, but the trends are not pointing in that direction. But your key competitor is doing great because they're focused on soda. Why aren't you doing the same thing? I said, look, when the writing is on the wall, it's too late to change. So you've almost got to zoom out and look at where the trends are going and make the changes a little bit ahead of time. So I felt very strongly we were in the right direction, as did our board, as did our employees. We made the changes and we're doing very well. And the rest is history. So I think today they look at me and say, why aren't you making the changes faster? Why aren't you transforming faster? Now, had I listened to many of them then and backed off, we would be in the same problem that other companies are facing. So I think it was painful then. It was very, very difficult, but as long as your board is behind you, and I have an outstanding board, and as long as you have clarity as to where you're leading the company, we're okay.
I don't think any CEO will go on the record criticizing her consumers, but I'm going to ask you about consumers. Because this question of how you time change, you want to change the product portfolio, you have to anticipate where consumers are going, but also presumably not be so far out ahead of them that a lot of resources get plowed into something where you don't get uptake. How do you understand the pace of change? Because the long-term trends, I think 2050, 2100 may be a little easier to understand than 2020 in a sense, because the old saying that change takes a long time to happen, but then it goes very quickly. How do you calibrate that? Well,
remember, what we're talking about is not walking away from product lines. We're talking about balancing the product lines. So the wonderful thing about food and beverage is we are consumers too. We as employees of the company are consumers too. We're all mothers, fathers, daughters, wives. We have children. So in a way, our families are big microcosms of what the consumer base is out there. So if you just look around the room in which our meetings are held, 10 years ago, they drank one kind of beverage. 5 years ago, they drank a different kind of beverages. I look at the percentage of consumption around the room. Today, it's a different mix. That is profound. So this is not about criticizing consumers or worrying where the consumers are going. We know in real time where the consumers are going. That's the first point. Point number two, all that you have to look at certain mega trends in society. If you look at healthcare costs going up too much and people worried about prevention rather than cure, you have to worry about what kind of products you're putting out there in the marketplace. So if you look at these as things you have to do under threat as opposed to this is an opportunity, I think it's more difficult to do it if you're worried. But if you do it as, wow, what a great growth opportunity, it works better. And that's what we were doing. We were telling our people, look, think of all the good for you products we could do. That could be a big growth area. And we should never have to tell the consumer that they have to pay more for health. We should never have to tell the consumer that if they consume a good for you product, it has to taste worse than a fun for you product. So by telling people that we have all the tools to offer a full range of products, our people look to this as a big growth opportunity. And so if you as a consumer, Aaron, if today you drank a Pepsi, that's great. Thank you for being in our franchise. Tomorrow if you drank a Tropicana instead of a Pepsi, thank you again for being in our franchise. From our perspective, we're indifferent because we put all these products out for you. So that's our goal. Give you the choice, but nudge you to make the right choices, but never have you have to pick between good for you and fun for you from an economic perspective.
Well, and clearly choices are proliferating, diversifying in all in all sorts of products. I'm going to ask Indra a couple of more questions, and then we'll have some microphones through the room, which is a very crowded room. That's great. We're also, remember, we're using Twitter. I told Indra beforehand I'm not checking my email with this tablet up here. I'm actually tracking questions that many of you are sending in. So hashtag AskBSR14. And we'll try to take questions both live and also via Twitter. Another quote I saw from you that I absolutely loved, I think you said this, if you were quoted accurately, never stop learning. When you're an entry-level employee fresh from college or a CEO, you don't know it all. Admitting this is not a sign of weakness. That's the part I really like. The strongest leaders are those who are lifelong students. How do you try to build that culture inside PepsiCo?
I think at this point, we don't have a choice. The world is changing in such profound ways around us. If you asked me 15 years ago, when I first joined PepsiCo, I joined them 20 years ago, but 15 years ago, if you'd asked me whether China was going to be the biggest market for beverages, snacks, for any product, I'd have said maybe, but I wouldn't have said it with so much conviction. Today, the Chinese beverage market is bigger than the US beverage market. in a very different way. It doesn't follow the same pattern as the US market. So we're being forced to learn markets, politics, cultures of China in an accelerated way. Now, if you were an executive that joined PepsiCo or were in PepsiCo already 15, 20 years ago, you probably never visited China and you didn't care about China because it wasn't big enough in PepsiCo. Today, if you want to be a senior executive in PepsiCo, you better know everything about China. How do you know China? How do you understand China without being a student of China? Reading everything about the history, the culture, the politics, how to do business in China, what's the role of government, what are the societal issues facing China? How do you do business in China without understanding it? So it doesn't come to you because you just download a chip into your head. You have to go study. You have to get books. You have to talk to people. You have to talk to experts. So if you took issue by issue by issue, issue after issue, water scarcity, how many people who grew up in the West know anything about water scarcity? They don't. But how can you run a global company when you've, and let me digress for a minute. I grew up in a water distressed environment. We had no water in Madras when I was growing up. It's still water distressed, but there was no water when I was growing up. And we learned how to live. The kids were given a bucket of water a day. We learned how to bathe, wash our clothes, everything with so much care. We learned how to scrunch ourselves and take a bath, did all that stuff. My kids take half-an-hour showers. Half an hour.
I feel your pain, by the way.
And this is after I bang on the door and say, it's half an hour, shut the damn shower off. Not because they don't know what water scarcity is. Now you just imagine, fast forward my kids. They become CEO of a company that's making beverages. Holy cow, you know what happens? Now we have to open a plant in India. It's still going to be water distressed 15 years from now, okay? You can tell that. Or China, groundwaters are depleting. Or California, or Texas, where there's severe water shortage. How are they going to understand in their hearts what changes need to be made, as opposed to saying, hey, this is how we do business. We expect you to give us water. It doesn't work that way. So I think if we don't educate people and make them lifelong students on all of the changes in the world around us, not from a superficial way, but understand it deeply, feel the core of the issue, walk a mile in the shoes of governments of every country you do, and walk a mile in the shoes of the NGOs. If you can't do that, you cannot successfully run global enterprises or businesses today. You just can't do it.
Very, very well said. I think waste in mature economies is environmentally ridiculous and economically ridiculous. It's basically we throw a third of the money away that we have because we throw away a third of the food, water, and energy that we generate.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Do me a favor, don't tell my kids I told you about the half-an-hour shower. I'll get a lot of grief. Yeah. So let's just keep it between you and me.
I was actually thinking that if you could talk to my sons, I'd be happy to talk to your kids, and then maybe a new voice might get a different result. I don't know.
They're the people that talk about environmental sustainability in a big way, yet they take half-an-hour showers.
Well, a good friend of mine who I think is here today, Joel McCower, says consumers are the biggest greenwashers around. Please don't tweet that, because, and I think we all have some inconsistencies that we need to work on. There's no doubt about it. All right, we've got. I'm going to pass along a couple of questions that I've gotten already from Twitter. And can people who are holding the mics raise their hands? My colleagues, great. So you can see a couple people over here, and the light's blinding me, but I suspect, back there as well. Thank you. Okay, here's some very good questions.
Be kind.
Well, everyone's been very polite. The internet is a very polite place. Actually, it's not.
Sure.
All right. Jenny Reynolds writes to ask, and by the way, some of these come from people inside the room, and we may have people outside the room as well. How do you retain competitive advantage while sharing cost-saving and sustainable practices? So this whole question of competition and collaboration.
So let me take a specific example of water shortage in China. Let's just pick a city in China, Gansu province in China, which has got extreme water shortage. There are people there who can consume our beverages, eat our Quaker oats, whatever. So also for our competition. But the community is water distressed. If we come up with an idea to save water and we can share it widely, I think the whole community will be better off, the community will improve. Not only can other beverage companies succeed and thrive, other companies can come in and help improve the plight of the entire society there to make them economically more advanced. There are areas where you can fiercely guard the IP and compete, ruthless competition. But there are other areas where we ought to say, let's figure out how to share this knowledge to improve society for the benefit of all. It's not easy, but I think from a mindset perspective, we have to be willing to make the changes. Now, let me just tell you something, Aaron. Even if we don't share it, it's there for the public to see, right? Because if you build check dams, I can't put a shroud over a check dam. Everybody can see we built a check dam. So don't immediately say, oh, because PepsiCo built a check dam, I won't build a check dam. Why don't we lean in and say, okay, maybe a check dam is a good idea. It's a low-cost way to rainwater harvest and channel the water. Why don't we quickly amplify check dams? So I think it's also within companies to not immediately dismiss your competitor's idea as a bad one because they did it, but to say, hey, why don't we pick the best and the brightest and scale it up quickly? So it's a mindset change.
So raise the baseline level and then compete on the top of that. Great. Let me see if we have any questions live from the audience. Again, we've got a microphone here. I'm going to ask and actually be ruthless about enforcing this. Please introduce yourself, questions, not statements, and try to be as concise as possible so we can get as many in as possible.
Good morning, Matt Swibel from Lockheed Martin. Can you give an example of U.S. public policy in the last couple of years that has helped you advance your sustainability agenda? And what is a barrier in public policy you have yet to overcome?
There are quite a few. Let me give you one. There was an issue on marketing to children, okay? And people are all flailing on what is the right standard on marketing to children because, you know, it's much better to operate in an environment where there's a policy and there's consistency. Because if you don't, then you open yourself for criticism from various constituencies. The FTC stepped in and put in a policy on marketing to children, which was uniform, right? Let me give you another one, the Clinton Global Initiative. What products can be sold in schools? When all companies were brought together by Bill Clinton as part of the Clinton Global Initiative, and we agreed on a way forward, you know, we could all go off and implement it for the betterment of society. So I think what you need is a strong convener and somebody who's actually willing to move the ball forward. And whether it's the government or whether it's somebody like a Clinton Global Initiative, it doesn't matter. It's just a strong convener. So we have had examples of that happening. Okay. The other one is the Carbon Trust, when they actually put out a carbon footprint label on your products in the UK. That's another example of a reputable organization with a good methodology, putting the right label on the product. So it helps companies follow that system and go forward. So those are examples.
I think the examples are really interesting because some are regulatory and some are, collaborations that can lead towards regulation, showing that that may be the way things happen in the 21st century. It doesn't necessarily start with government.
I think government struggles more than organizations like a Clinton Global Initiative or the WHO, I think, can do more if it's sensible policy enactment. So I think we've got to let these organizations get more teeth and work with them constructively, not just to keep fighting everything they do, but to say, hey, how can we work together to move the ball forward in a constructive way? And I think there's opportunity and there's enough examples, and whether it's the environmental area or people area, there's a lot that's happening right now.
Let me go to this side of the room. We have a question right there. Yes.
Hi. Thank you, Indra. My name is Jody Weiss, and I'm here with World Blue, which announces every year the most transparent, inclusive, collaborative democratically run companies on the planet. And I was wondering what your opinion was about areas of the world where women's leadership is really not embraced, where diversity is really not embraced, and what your recommendations are. Thank you.
It's one of the most difficult issues, and I tell you, many of us companies headquartered in the West, especially in the United States, have an incredible sense of conscience about doing the right thing in those countries to encourage women and sort of bring them into the workforce, because if you really provide economic empowerment for women, I think overall society improves and the women's plight improves too. So we do our part. Progress is slow, but we do our part. Example, in Saudi Arabia, where women and men are not allowed to work together, we actually built a manufacturing plant where only women work. Okay? There's another plant we have where there's a wall, where the women work on one side and the product transfers on to the other side and men work there too. In our offices, we have some brilliant women, but they work in a different part of the office and they don't come together where the men are. And so we've been able to adapt our working practices to make sure we respect the laws of that country, yet do the right thing for women as we see it from the Western perspective. The thing we have to be very careful about, we cannot flaunt the laws of the local countries. We can't. We cannot rewrite the laws. What we can do is, within the laws of every country, do our best to encourage women and minorities as defined by every country that we do business in. And that's what we're doing, literally country after country. Okay?
You can't flout the laws, but is there a role for multinational companies to encourage local governments to move their laws closer to internationally accepted standards?
Through careful discussion. Careful discussion. I think the thing we have to be very, very careful about is we cannot come across in those countries as we know better than you. Okay? And that's a surefire way of getting thrown out of the country. So it's a very judicious balance, especially I speak for myself as a female CEO. I have to be very careful about not being too strident and sounding like, oh, there she goes again, kind of a thing. I've got to strike a very careful balance to say, yes, we respect the laws of the country, but would you be okay if we did this so that we can actually do the right thing for women within the framework of the laws of the country? And that's where we've been successful when we've had constructive dialogue with governments. Okay?
I think we should encourage more male CEOs to say, I shouldn't come off as strident. That might help things as well.
No comments.
Yeah. I have a question from a BSR alum, Celine Suarez, who's asking, what can CFOs do to engage mainstream investors to look towards the longer term? What's the role of the CFO here?
I think that, in fact, I'd say many CFOs I meet today are already enlightened and see the need for long-term thinking. So that's the good news. I have a fabulous CFO who thinks that way. So I'm very lucky in that way. Investors are beginning to engage in this dialogue. They're beginning to engage in the dialogue. But I think there's more. I think you've got to talk about investor education. The one example I'll give you, it struck me. I was in an investor conference and I had an investor who was running a pension fund manager who was running a sovereign wealth fund in Hong Kong. And a young person, 1.5-hour meeting, lots of questions about how do you do talent development, how are you thinking about your portfolio, what are the big risks that could impact PepsiCo into the future. Really profound questions. He wanted to understand how we're managing the company for the long term. And after the discussion was over, I stopped and asked this person, I said, you didn't ask me a single question about the next quarter or 2 quarters out. Do you want some more time? Because it was sort of an unusual meeting. He looked at me puzzled and he said, I run several tens of billions of dollars pension fund. I have to make sure for those pensioners, I have a reasonable capital gains and a dividend payment that's coming out. I have very few companies in the world who are big, large cap companies with good businesses who are steady performers. And for those companies, I have to worry about Are they doing the right things to stay in business for a long time? So the questions that I focus on are these long-term, foundational questions. Then there are those companies, which is a small part of my portfolio, where I have to worry about the short term because it's sort of high-risk companies. You're not one of them. Juxtapose that with the next conversation I had with an investor in the West. Hey, Indra, how's the quarter shaping up? It was like, for a CEO, it's like a jarring coming back. So I think there's an investor education that has to be done to say, we're not asking you not to ask about the quarter. Do ask about the quarter. We want to talk about the quarter or the year or whatever. But can you also add enough questions about fundamentally what does the strategy mean? What are the implications of that? Are you doing the right thing to make sure this company is going to be around for a long time? That's the kind of questions that I think there's got to be a lot more investor education and outreach.
Let's go back over to this side of the room. Do we have any questions? Yep, Jessica, you've got one. Great.
Hi, Indra. It's Heath Gibson from Standard Chartered Bank. I'd like to understand the interaction that you have with NGOs, and I guess specifically on an issue within your industry at the moment is palm oil consumption.
I'm not going to name any NGOs in this meeting, okay? That's my goal. But there are two kinds of companies. Companies that promise the world, put out all kinds of goals, and don't really deliver to it. Or worse still, put out all kinds of goals, but don't put out the goal and a time frame by which you accomplish it. Then there are those companies that put out the goal, the time frame, talk about progress, and also tell you when you don't make the progress because the technology is not there or we didn't have enough people to supply us with a certain product. I think the latter group of companies are the kind of companies you want, because the former group of companies are just waiting to get some NGO off their back, whether it's sustainable palm oil, sustainable farming techniques, whether it's human rights. I think it's very, very important that when we engage with NGOs, when companies engage with NGOs, NGOs give credit to those companies that set a goal, a time frame by which they'll achieve the goal, and show specific scorecards to assess progress against those goals and the time frame. If those three don't happen, don't laud that company. Don't hold up a company who's pronounced lofty goals without a time frame and a scorecard as the example that you should be following, because I think that's hollow. And today, I think you're seeing a lot of that happening with many NGOs, and I'll leave it there.
So it's important for companies to admit where they're falling short, which is not what companies, that's not in the DNA of business and business communications necessarily. That's new.
But I think we should. I tell you, when we did our sustainability report, we specifically called out the fact that we're trying to reduce sugar, but for all of a sudden there's the swing towards full sugar products. It's puzzling to us, and move away from diet products, which is a way to reduce sugar. So we said, look, we need to find new technologies to do that. It's okay to be honest, because this next iteration might require different tools, different ways to approach it. But I don't know, if I was running an NGO, I'd rather have the honesty than sort of smoke and mirrors. That's my honest belief. And I hope you are that way too, Aaron. I know you are.
More or less.
More or less.
Yeah. No, we're doing, we're going to be on the hot seat later today. People can ask us anything, so, and we'll answer honestly. Okay, I've got one more question from Twitter, then I'm going to go to this side of the room for one last question from the audience. Matt Mooney says, people do what they're incented to do, which I think we all know. What are the biggest incentives that need to change to encourage long-term thinking, say, inside a company like PepsiCo?
Interestingly, I think we balance the short and the long term. People's annual bonuses are set on the short term, delivery of that year's performance. But most of our compensation is long-term incentives. So if you look at my own personal compensation, 70 to 80% of my compensation is based on long-term performance. So I think companies are making progress. What if we were to apply the same metric to portfolio managers? What if we told them that 20 to 30% of your compensation is going to be tied to the performance of your portfolio in the short term, and 70% is going to be tied to the long-term performance of the portfolio? Because if our performance and investment managers' performance goals and design don't line up, that's where the problem comes about. I mean, I'll speak for myself, and I don't think I'm the exception. I think many CEOs are like me. I own 23 times my salary in PepsiCo stock. Most of my net worth beyond my home is the PepsiCo stock. So I am totally and completely vested in the success of this company long term. Because my goal is not to step out as CEO and just dump all my stock. This is my holding for the rest of my life. I've given 50 years of my life, compacted into 20 years into PepsiCo. It means a lot, means a lot. And so I feel the company head, heart, and hands. When somebody from the outside comes and tells me, oh, you got to run the company differently, great, give me ideas, I'll listen to it. But we are all vested in this company massively. And so I think if we align incentives of the people inside the company to those of portfolio managers, I think we could actually have an incredible future.
Why isn't there, you mentioned executive compensation, why isn't there a group of 10, 20, 50 CEOs saying, collectively this is a big issue that deserves real attention and potential change?
We've said it. We've talked about, CEOs have talked about CEO compensation time and time again. If that is the lightning rod for everybody, let's solve it. But don't keep using it as a lightning rod. You know what it feels like? We need some issue to whip all the time. It's CEO compensation. If we resolve it, then there's nothing else to whip. So let's keep whipping this thing and let's not resolve it. So what do? We come up with multiple to worker's salary. Makes no sense, because if you have a global workforce, are you going to benchmark it to a multiple of the US laborer or the laborer in Argentina or Venezuela? I don't know. How do you benchmark this? Or they'll say, put it as a metric of some other indicator. But then they'll say, we may not get the best and the brightest because the CEO jobs are tough today. Let's decide, is it capitalism or not? What do we want to regulate? What do we want to not regulate? Let's decide on all of those things. Once we decide, step back. The integrated scorecard should drive companies. Don't constantly pick at something to go at companies and their leaders. It's tiring.
You landed where what I was going to suggest, that the idea of an integrated scorecard might create a holistic approach to this and a lot of other issues. I'm going to apologize to this side of the room because we're out of time and we're not going to be able to take another question. But we do have time to give a warm thank you to Indra for joining us.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.